So, my thesis for my project was understanding stigma around substance use disorder through an intersectional lens. I chose to focus on stigma around substance use disorder because I work with a population of people who struggle with addiction. Um, and sometimes I get stuck in the mindset of, oh, I'm an open person, I'm not judgmental. But I think when growing up in a society where we're taught people who struggle with addiction are lazy, they're not worthy of help, they choose to be addicted, it's impossible not to internalize those stereotypes. And it's important as a social worker to constantly do research and reflect, to work on deconstructing those internal biases, because like we always say, we don't know what we don't know. I also wanted to look at this from an intersectional lens, considering the fact that people who struggle with substance use disorder are, or substance use disorder affects marginalized communities disproportionately. And I wanted a better understanding of why certain populations are more at risk. I think it's easy to assume that people who struggle with addiction, it's because it's a direct result of trauma. This is very valid and true, but also I feel like it gets overlooked how marginalized communities in general have a lot less access to resources. They have minimal resources or access to healthcare. I mean, everyone in this country does in general, but especially marginalized communities um, just have less access to healthcare and other resources. And this is definitely a factor to why substance use disorder is more prevalent in certain populations and marginalized communities. And I wanted a better understanding of this. Um, so one thing I learned is the different forms of stigma, and I honed in on practitioner or health practitioner stigma. Um, an example of health practitioner stigma is that people of color, especially Black people, are 26% less likely to receive pain medication compared to white people. Um, this is just racism blatantly in health practitioners. So, but more specifically, when talking about substance use disorder, women, or I read that one study that was done in Australia actually, women have a lot less access to care for substance use disorder. Through an intersectional lens, the compounding identities of being a woman and having substance use disorder goes against the social norms of how drug use violates the norms of womanhood. So, in general, women are a lot more stigmatized and looked down upon for having substance use disorder because of the expectation of purity in womanhood. Again, substance use disorder in general is heavily stigmatized, but health care practitioners are a lot more likely to stigmatize women, and they especially do not receive the access of care that they need. Also, another thing that I learned from doing my research is that people of color are a lot more likely to people of color are way more likely to be incarcerated for substance use disorder compared to white people. I think when talking about the stigmatization of addiction, we cannot ignore mass incarceration. We can see with the war on drugs, people in the 80s were getting sentenced for a minimum of 5 years for 5 grams of crack, but we're getting sentenced with a minimum of 5 years for around 500 grams of cocaine. Crack and cocaine, essentially the same drug, but the difference is race. Crack was primarily used in impoverished communities and marginalized populations. And then cocaine in the 80s was primarily used in more rich communities and white communities. So the association with cocaine is whiteness. This association with crack is people of color. Therefore, people were way more heavily sentenced for possession of crack. So racism is still connected to incarceration, especially drug use, to this day. But the bottom line is that people, especially people of color, are being incarcerated for having a disease, and it's just completely heartbreaking to know that people are in prison for something that they weren't hurting anyone else. And basically the government the whole war on drugs was just a whole scheme to incarcerate Black individuals, but also the government would rather put people in prison rather than to get them the help that they need. And also, I often hear people talk about how people are in jail for marijuana charges and how this is unjust, but that's very valid. But it often goes ignored that people are also in jail for possession of crack, possession of heroin, and that's just as bad. I think when talking about different types of addictions, we have to recognize that some are more stigmatized because of the association of race along with those drugs, if that makes sense. Crack and heroin are more heavily stigmatized because they're predominantly used in marginalized communities, while things like weed, cocaine, Xanax are a lot more normalized and people don't face the same sentences for possession of those drugs because of their association with whiteness. I see this issue a lot in college. I think in party culture, I hear a lot about people saying, oh, I'll do cocaine, but I'll never touch crack or heroin, and just that mindset. I think a lot of people don't see how that association of certain drugs being, bottom line, like, yes, cocaine, crack, heroin, all that's really bad for your health. Like, we all know that, but the association of like some drugs being okay and more normalized, especially in like party culture, I can see this in college, and some being like, oh, untouchable, like I never do that. It's just like, yes, because the association of those drugs, it's more that people don't want to be associated with drugs that are outside of like the white acceptable norm. And this all just stems back from the war on drugs in the 80s, and how, I could talk a lot about mass incarceration and drug use for a long time and how it's connected to racism. But another important thing that I learned from researching the topic of substance use disorder and stigma around addiction through an intersectional lens is the epidemic of houselessness and addiction for LGBTQ plus teenagers. Oftentimes, LGBTQ plus teenagers will be disowned by their family, leaving them houseless, and this also has they're more at risk for substance use disorder because of the trauma that they experience from this, being marginalized, but also just the lack of access to care and healthcare when people are experiencing houselessness. LGBTQ plus teens are extremely and disproportionately experiencing houselessness than other populations, and disproportionately struggling with substance use disorder because of that marginalization, because of that trauma, and because of that lack of access to healthcare. So I guess the three main points I learned from my studies through an intersectional lens, like, there's so much to go into. I guess the stigmatization around substance use disorder in our culture, it's so deep rooted and there's so much to unpack. But with the time that I had to research, women are extremely and disproportionately receiving way less access to healthcare because substance use disorder goes against the social norm of womanhood and purity, and health practitioners are a lot more likely to stigmatize their disease because of this. Then we can see that a lot of people in our society believe that people of color should be punished and for substance use disorder, while at the same time believing that white people are more likely of help, and that Black people should be punished for addiction. Incarceration rates for possession of drug use is so disproportionate compared from people of color compared to white people. And then, yes, lastly, there's an epidemic with houselessness and the population of LGBTQ plus teens, and within this population, substance use disorder, they're a lot more at risk for this disease. So those are my key takeaways. And yeah, I'm hoping with this information that I've learned, it's broadened my perspective in an intersectional lens of the causes of mass substance use disorder in our culture, and hopefully it has helped to deconstruct some internal biases I may have had. So yeah, thank you.